प्रीवियस सेशन में हमने टेक्सचुअल मीनिंग्स और एक्सप्लेनेशंस देखे थे पोएम के. Sonnet 7, How Soon Hath Time the Subtle Thief of Youth by John Milton. इसका दूसरा टाइटल है On His Arriving in His 23 year. तीसरा टाइटल है On His 23rd birthday. अब हम उसकी थीम्स को देखते हैं. Theme of work, ambition and aging. How Soon Hath Time is in part a poem about the fear of failing to accomplish something meaningful in life. In the first 8 lines, the speaker complains that he has reached the ripe old age of 23 without doing much of note. In making this complaint, the speaker suggests that the value of his life depends on his actions and more specifically, his accomplishments. Though he will complicate this assertion by the end of the poem, he initially argues that his merit as a man depends on the work he produces during his dwindling time on earth. Dwindling यानी कि धीरे धीरे कम होता हुआ. जिंदगी तो गुजर ही रही है हमारी. The poem begins with the speaker announcing his astonishment about how quickly his life has gone by. Describing time as a thief in the poem's first line, the speaker characterizes his experience of aging as one of loss, even robbery. Something vital has been taken from him. As the poem continues, it becomes clear that what he has lost or is losing is possibility itself, यानी कि संभावनाएं. The possibility of accomplishing something grand and ambitious. The speaker notably describes himself as on the verge of being fully a man, यानी कि वो एक तरीके से पूरे परिपक्व होने के बस सोपान पर खड़े हैं, उसके एंट्रेंस या द्वार पर खड़े हैं. Yet though his youth is behind him, he has yet to produce a bud or blossom. Bud or blossom का मतलब है कोई नमूना, कोई उदाहरण या कोई सबूत कि हाँ वो मैच्योर हो चुके हैं. Here the speaker plays with some of the tropes of Renaissance poetry, in which youth is often compared to spring. The speaker is somehow out of joint with time. Though his spring is almost over, he has yet to bear any flowers. In its density of symbolic language, the poem raises some implicit questions for its reader. One might wonder, for instance, what these buds or blossoms represent. That is, what the speaker hopes to accomplish in his life and has not yet. In this regard, the speaker is circumspect, refusing to specifically unfold his ambitions for his readers. But he does make some tantalizing hints. For instance, he uses the word career in line 3. He employs it primarily in an old-fashioned sense, meaning something like rushing recklessly, यानी कि बिना देखे तेज़ दौड़ लगाना और किसी चीज़ में टकराने की जब संभावना होती है, और running out of control. But the modern sense of the word is present too. The speaker wants to do something meaningful and consequential with his life. Consequential means important, जो सार गर्मित हो. And he wants to do it in a way that other people will recognize. In line 7, he then notes that he has inward ripeness. That is, that he is full of inner beauty and potential. Yet that inner beauty does not register like the buds and blossoms he desires in line 4. No one else can see it or celebrate it. The first 8 lines thus present an ambitious yet anxious speaker, someone who is eager to make his mark on the world, yet who feels his life slipping by, and who feels like his life will be meaningless unless he manages to accomplish some grand public project that other people can witness and appreciate. The poem thus implicitly asks readers to consider an important set of questions about life itself. Working through the speaker's anxiety, the reader begins to wonder what makes life meaningful. The speaker suggests an answer to that question. Work makes life meaningful, and the things one accomplishes are what matter. Theme of faith, grace, and self surrender. The first 8 lines of the poem present an anxious speaker. Ambitious यानी कि महत्वाकांक्षी, anxious यानी कि चिंतित, eager to make his mark on the world. In the final 6 lines, following the sonnet's volta or turn, the speaker contemplates an alternate source of meaning for his life, not work but faith. Instead of striving actively towards some grand accomplishment, the speaker argues that God will guide him to the right path and the right task. The poem thus implicitly takes a side in the religious debates that fractured means divided England in the 17th century. Instead of advocating for salvation through works, a position broadly aligned with Catholicism, Milton, who was a devout and militant Protestant, यानी कि वो बहुत श्रद्धा थी उनको लेकिन प्रोटेस्टेंट फेथ में, appears to take a Puritan standpoint. उनका मतलब है faith alone, the poem suggests, guarantees salvation, कि केवल काम करने से नहीं, श्रद्धा रखने से मुक्ति मिलती है. In the poem's final lines, the speaker offers himself a kind of correction to the position he has established in the prior lines. No matter how hard he struggles to accomplish something grand, he will do it when and only when God wants him to. Indeed, he suggests that God has already determined his lot. That is, God has a plan for him, and the speaker will do nothing more and nothing less than what God intends. One might wonder then whether the speaker has free will. Though the first 8 lines of the poem posit that it is up to the speaker himself to make something of his own life, then will enters the poem in line 12. It is the will of heaven that matters, not the speaker's. यानी कि ईश्वर की मर्जी से ज़िंदगी हमारी ज़िंदगी चलती है, व्यक्ति की इच्छाओं से नहीं. Ultimately, however, the poem is less interested in free will than it is in the idea of grace. A crucial complication to the speaker's deference to God's will is that he may accomplish God's plan only if he has grace. Grace is a charged word in Puritan theology. प्यूरिटन थियोलॉजी का के क्या अर्थ है और मायने हैं बाद में आपको समझा दिया जाएगा अलग से. It separates the elect who will go to heaven from those who won't. Further, in many Protestant sects, grace manifested in worldly success. To prosper in business or politics or to have many children were both considered signs that God had bestowed grace upon someone. The speaker's anxiety in the first 8 lines thus may have less to do with the scale of his accomplishments and more to do with whether he has grace. यानी कि उनको अपनी कामयाबियों के बारे में चिंता नहीं है, उनको चिंता इस बात की है कि ईश्वर की कृपा उन पर बनी हुई है या नहीं. The fact that he has yet to accomplish much might be a sign that God has not given him grace, or it might be a sign that God's plan for the speaker is humble and quiet. The speaker cannot be sure yet which is true. Since grace comes from God as a gift, it cannot be acquired आप उसको प्राप्त नहीं कर सकते हैं। ईश्वर आपको आशीर्वाद के स्वरूप में देता है, नो मैटर हाउ हार्ड वन वर्क्स और प्रेज। This marks an important difference between Protestant sects like the Puritans and the Catholic Church, which does believe that one can influence their fate through piety or charitable acts. At stake in the poem, then, is not just whether the speaker will accomplish something important. The speaker is also locating himself in his era's most pressing questions of religious doctrine. In the first 8 lines, he flirts with a Catholic position, suggesting that the value of his life comes from his works. In the final 6 lines, he returns to a Puritan position. The value of his life is granted by God, and thus his task is to surrender himself to God's plan and accomplish it as best he can. In making this correction, the speaker suggests that the value of his life depends on God, not on himself. The poem thus initially appears to be self-involved, a young person thinking through the meaning of his own life. But its religious argument suggests that its ambitions are broader. If the reader feels similar anxieties about their life and career, the poem supplies a model. In Milton's mind, a theologically sound one, for how to handle those anxieties. By surrendering to God's plan, trusting in His grace, and accomplishing only what He intends. He means God. Sonnet 7. How soon hath time, the subtle thief of youth? Symbols. First, the symbol of spring. In line 4 and again in line 7, the speaker compares himself to the spring and the things it produces. Buds, blossoms, ripe fruit. स्प्रिंग का मतलब यहाँ पर है बसंत ऋतु से, जब धरती एक तरीके से पुनर्जीवित होती है. In doing so, he plays on a standard trope of Renaissance poetic tradition. ट्रोप का मतलब, रेनेसा का मतलब, ये सब आपको बाद में दे दिए जाएंगे. Renaissance poets often compared the course of human life to the course of the year, and Renaissance readers would have been aware of the general context with such symbolic language usually appears in. Mostly that is in love poetry. Milton then is taking a resource from the secular, often sexual rhetoric of his culture and redeploying it in a religious context. In How Soon Hath Time, the symbol of spring thus serves a double purpose. Excuse me. On the one hand, it shows that Milton's speaker has failed to accomplish what he thinks he's supposed to have accomplished by this point in his life. His spring is late, यानी कि उनके जीवन का बसंत पीछे चल रहा है, लेट है. The bud or blossom to which the speaker refers is not specified but is implied to be in reference to some sort of work. The speaker has potential but has yet to create anything of merit, like a spring flower that has yet to bloom and is running out of time to do so before winter, symbolic of death, before winter comes. On the other hand, spring as a symbol also shows that Milton himself is out of joint with his own culture. He understands its resources, but he refuses to use them in the way that other poets do. Instead of participating in the erotic conventions of Renaissance poetry, he reclaims those conventions for his own purpose. Next, the symbol of wings and flight. In line 2, Milton describes time as a creature with wings, जो उड़ सकता है. Wings यानी कि पंख, जो उड़ने के लिए काम आते हैं. And again in line 3 evokes the imagery of flight यानी कि उड़ान. Most basically this is meant to symbolize the fleeting nature of time, which appears to the speaker to flitter past, uncontrollable, uncatchable, like a bird that soars out of humankind's reach. More broadly, wings themselves are a rich symbol that suggests Christianity's deep connection to and authority over the past. A number of significant and interesting creatures have wings. Angels, यानी कि देवदूत जिनके हम कहते हैं, या परियां. Greek gods like Hermes, birds, इन सब के पंख होते हैं. Milton does not specify what kind of wings time has, nor for that matter, what kind of winged creature time is. Time's activities, though, give some hints. It is hard to imagine a devout Christian poet like Milton describing angels as thieves, and Milton's considered consistent personification of time makes it seem more human than a bird. Personification का मायना भी बाद में आएगा. For that reason, Milton is most likely thinking of time on the model of a god like Hermes, a Greek god known as a winged trickster. The presence of this Greek divinity, ग्रीक शब्द ग्रीस से लिया है. ग्रीस हिंदी में जिसको हम यूनान कहते हैं, ये एक देश का नाम है. यूरोप में एक देश है जिसका नाम यूनान या ग्रीस है. However subtle in this poem is puzzling. Why would a Christian poet invoke a pagan god in the midst of a poem about the power and authority of his own god? Part of the answer lies in Milton's deep learning. He was a scholarly poet who consistently drew upon the resources of past poetic accomplishments in shaping his own. In doing so, he makes an argument about the relationship between his own Christian faith and those past cultures. Christianity, in Milton's treatment, does not simply render the classical past obsolete. It also includes that past, bringing it under its own influence. Sonnet 7, Poetic Devices and Figurative Language. सबसे पहले है एलिट्रेशन. एलिट्रेशन शब्द का अर्थ आपको शायद दे चुके हैं पहले. जब किसी भी अक्षर की ध्वनि बार बार आती है तो उस रेपिटेशन ऑफ साउंड को एलिट्रेशन कहते हैं. How soon hath time makes frequent use of alliteration. For example, in the poem's first 5 lines, Milton establishes a strong chain of repeated S sound, which is more specifically an example of sibilance. Sa की जो आवाज़ है, which appears in soon, subtle and stolen. He also creates a repeated F, B and T sounds throughout. The alliteration at times suggests an underlying connection between rather disparate concepts. Disparate यानी कि विपरीत विचार throughout the poem, such as time, theft, flight, youth and spring. In the second half of the poem, one is struck by the more direct and immediate connections between alliterating words. For example, grace and great in lines 13-14. Here it is God's grace that makes him great. It is natural and even elegant that these two conceptually linked words should also be related sonically. Sonically यानी कि ध्वनि के आधार पर. This conceptual and sonic connection is also evident in words like still, strictest, soon and slow, which all generally relate to the idea of motion and control. The poem thus embodies its argument in sound. When the speaker is struggling with anxiety and confusion, the alliteration becomes confused, full of questions. It is unclear how. When he finds his way towards certainty, The alliteration becomes smooth, elegant, and appropriate. Next is metaphor. How soon hath time contains a number of metaphors. Metaphor का मतलब है comparison. जब दो अनरिलेटेड बातों में हम कंपैरिजन करते हैं या जब किसी एक चीज़ को किसी दूसरी चीज़ का हम प्रतीक मानते हैं, वो मेटाफर होता है. दैट सटली शेप इट्स आर्ग्यूमेंट. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, इन द फर्स्ट लाइन मिल्टन कंपेयर्स टाइम टू अ thief. Before one learns anything about the speaker's particular anxieties, there is already a strong sense of how the speaker feels about time itself. It has wronged and robbed him. Another metaphor occurs in line 3. Days do not literally fly by. By using this language, connects their swift passage to the winged time. Similarly, the speaker compares his youth to the spring in line 4. Once again, the metaphor creates a sense of how the speaker feels about his own life. He thinks it should follow a regular pattern with major events happening on a certain schedule. Any deviation from this schedule will be experienced as painful, even perverse. In a poem which is so rhetorical, so concerned with making an argument, each element of the poem, even its images and analogies means comparisons, एक तरीके से, या जब एक चीज़ किसी दूसरी चीज़ का प्रतीक होती है, सीधे सीधे जब प्रतीक होता है, contributing to framing and sustaining the argument. पर्सोनिफिकेशन का मतलब है जब किसी बेजान चीज़ को या केवल वो बात जो एक विचार है उसको जब हम इंसानी रूप दे देते हैं, वो तरीका पर्सोनिफिकेशन कहलाता है, यानी कि किसी को पर्सनैलिटी देना. In the first line of How Soon Hath Time, the speaker compares time, जो कि केवल एक विचार है, which he deems a proper noun, to a thief. This personification gives time human characteristics, namely agency and desire. Building on this initial comparison, Milton continues to grant time agency throughout the poem. He steals things in line 2, and he leads the speaker in line 12. By the end of the poem, time seems like a character in its own right, with its own ideas and priorities. This is potentially an interpretive problem for a Christian poem about God's capacity to control and regulate the speaker's own life. The reader might wonder whether time is an expression of God's will, operating under his control, or if time has independence and as such must be a separate semi-divine force with which God collaborates. At key points in the poem, often because of Milton's use of personification, time seems to be independent or even God's equal. Needless to say, this is a potentially heretical claim. इन अ क्रिश्चियन वर्ल्ड, हेरेटिकल यानी कि जो ईश्वर की आस्था के विपरीत हो. इन अ क्रिश्चियन वर्ल्ड, गॉड इज़ द ओनली डिविनिटी. As is often the case in Milton's writing, his stated religious positions come into conflict with the way he discusses religious issues. As a result of moments like this, William Blake famously claimed that Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it. Sonnet 7 vocabulary. ये पोएम में लिए हुए शब्द हैं और उनका अर्थ है. तो जो डार्क हो रहे हैं वो टेक्स्ट के शब्द हैं. मैं सब कुछ नहीं पढ़ूंगी, केवल लिस्ट बता रही हूँ आपको. सटल, हेस्टिंग, करियर, शूइथ, सेम्बलेंस, अराइव्ड, टाइमली हैप्पी, एंड्यूइथ, मेजर, मीन, ग्रेस, एट्सेट्रा. आप इनके अर्थ देख लीजिएगा. फॉर्म, मीटर, राइम स्कीम ऑफ द पोएम. सबसे पहले फॉर्म. हाउ सून हैड टाइम इज़ अ पेट्रार्क इन सोनेट. एज सच इट कैन बी डिवाइडेड इन 2 parts. द फर्स्ट 8 lines of the poem, the octave, stand as a unit and they have a distinctive rhyme scheme. The final 6 lines of the poem, the sestet, work as a second separate unit with its own rhyme scheme and often its own ideas. The pivot between these two parts in line 9 is called the turn or the volta. यहाँ पर पोइम का विचार बदलता है, यानी कि जब पोइम में टर्न या वोल्टा आता है, यानी कि जो बात उन्होंने पोइम के पहले वाले हिस्से में कही है, बाद वाले हिस्से में बात बदल जाती है. Petrarchan poets use the two halves of the poem rhetorically, advancing the idea for or an argument in the first 8 lines, which they often reverse, complicate, or contradict in the poem's final 8 lines. Indeed, reading this poem, one has a sense that something is turning, changing after its first 8 lines. Milton thus relies on the typical sonnet structure heavily here, introducing doubts and anxieties in the poem's octet. Octave को octet भी कहते हैं, which he resolves in part by contradicting the assumptions that underlie those anxieties in the poem's sestet. The meter. Like almost all English sonnets, How Soon Hath Time is written in the iambic pentameter, जिसमें आवाज़ डा डम में आती है, यानी कि एक हल्का और एक भारी स्वर निकलता है. Rhyme scheme. The rhyme scheme of How Soon Had Time, as with all Petrarchan sonnets, can be divided into 2 parts. The poem's first 8 lines uses just 2 rhyme sounds repeated in the pattern ABBA, ABBA. In the second half, Milton uses a particularly unusual rhyme scheme in the final 6 lines of his poem CDE, DCE. Sonnet 7. The Speaker. The speaker of How Soon Had Time is an ambitious young man, reflecting anxiously on what he has accomplished life and finding solace for his anxieties in his religious faith. Critics traditionally treat the poem as autobiographical, and there is strong support for this autobiographical reading. For one thing, the poem expresses religious views that Milton passionately defends elsewhere. Further, like the poem's speaker, Milton was 23 years old when he wrote it, living at home with his parents and pursuing a leisurely course of theological study. However, the poem is also clearly intended to instruct its readers and to help them manage their own anxieties. In this sense, whether the poem is autobiographical or not does not really matter. The poem is both specific and universal. It expresses Milton's personal circumstances and in doing so expresses universal human worries, यानी कि हर आदमी, हर व्यक्ति जब जवान हो जाता है तो उसको अपने जीवन को लेकर चिंताएं सताती हैं और वो ही चिंता इस पोएम में भी व्यक्त की गई है. The setting of the poem. The setting for How Soon Had Time is England in the 1630s, most likely in the rural countryside where Milton was living with his parents at the time he wrote the sonnet. However, the poem contains few references to its specific setting, with the exception of the buds and blooms in line 4. The poem does not reference the external world. Instead, its true landscape is internal, the psyche of the speaker, where he wrestles with doubt, anxiety, and faith. This contributes to the sense that the poem's message is universal. Instead of attaching itself to a particular time and place, it locates itself in the fears and anxieties everyone shares. The literary and historical context. Literary context. John Milton wrote the poem in the early 1630s when Milton sat down to write this sonnet. Then he was working with a form that had a distinguished history, that is, the sonnet. One of the challenges facing Milton as a poet was to find a new possibility and energy for the form. Milton tried to revive the sonnet by transforming its content. Whether the sonnet was traditionally used For love poetry, Milton transformed it into a poem about the agonies and ecstasies of religious devotion. Historical context. How Soon Had Time was written at a fraught moment in English history. In 1625, Charles I had become King of England, and under his reign, religious and political discontent within the country began to boil over. यानी कि लोग धार्मिक और राजनीतिक स्तर पर बहुत ही नाखुश थे. By 1642, 10 years after Milton wrote the poem, the country had descended into civil war. In 1649, Charles was executed, यानी कि put to death. Milton strongly supported the revolution and even defended the execution of the king. और इसी के साथ poem On His 23rd Birthday by John Milton comes to an end. Thank you.